In this episode, we're using styled components in React.js. If you don't know what styled components are, it pretty much allows us to write CSS in JavaScript using template literals, and it allows us to define our components with styles. So no longer is our components going to need to refer back to a style sheet or use class names. Each component will have styles that are kind of predefined before they are rendered. In the example that they give us, we have button as a component. It references the A tag, and so anything in here is CSS. It also allows us to pass props. In this case, we're passing a primary prop to determine what a primary button is. So a primary button has a white background and the color is pale violet red. We could see that the primary button is GitHub and the default button would refer to documentation. If we jump into the documentation, you can always go to motivation to find more reasons why styled components is awesome. I always prefer to use styled components in large applications, just so I don't need to remember class names and I can always remember what a component is, knowing that it matches the styles. So to get started, we are going to look at the mock we'll be referencing to. So in this case, we have a button component, which has 4 different buttons, and a search bar component, which just has this one search bar. So we will create a styled component with the default styles here, and we'll press in props such as outline, primary, and secondary, so that we can get our different types of buttons. The second component is the search bar. It is just one component, but in our case, I'll show you how to create that component, and we can always reference other ones as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the code so we can get this project started. As always, you can find the project files in the description. The master branch that I have linked below will have the final project, and the starter branch is where the starter files will be located. So I am using React. All I did was run create React app or recreate React app, and then I installed styled components through npm install --save style-components. You can always reference back to the documentation if you get lost. So running npm run start will get us to localhost 3000, and if we jump into our React app, we can see it's just a blank screen. I'm gonna go ahead and break down this project file for you real quick. What I have is inside source is a styles folder. This has elements.js, which I'll touch on in a second, and then global.js, which just exports our colors. Let me get rid of the terminal. So it just exports our colors so that we can always reference back to them. The next thing we have is the SVG folder, and it just has a search SVG icon. The search SVG icon is this little guy here. Next, in our app.css, you could copy this if you didn't get the project files down below. I am using Avenir, but it defaults down to Seago UI and Tahoma, and all the rest ones as fallback options. The .app parent, which is the div class name here, is going to have display flex and align items to center. Now to get started, we need to import styled from styled components. And the first component we are going to create is a container. Everyone should be familiar with containers. It just allows us to add a specific width and make nested elements sort of contained within its dimensions. So go ahead and write const container. And when defining our components, make sure you use capital letters or camel case. So it's going to be const container assigned to styles.div. And this right here, when after the styled, can be any JSX or HTML element. So in this case, it is a div, but if you're using a button, it's going to be a. You could also do span tags and p tags, and then H1s, H2s, H3s, H4s, and any tag that you know HTML, it works here. So const container equal to styled.div. And so the container width is going to be 1280 pixels with a min width of 1280 pixels. Our margin is going to be set to 0 auto. And in our container, we're going to have a nested element, which is row. When using styled components, I would recommend that you make every single element a component. But in our case, I just want to show you that you can actually nest elements. So the dot row is going to be a width of 100% with the display set to flex. And we're going to align the items to center. To render out this component, all we simply need to do is call it and render it out here. Save that, and nothing visible should happen, but if we just put hi YouTube it should be within a container. Let's go ahead and refresh that. And so this is within that container. We can add a background of pink just to show you the widths and that the container is actually rendering. The second component I'm going to create is a subhead component, and what subhead component will represent is just the button and the search bar text. So to create that, we could just do const subhead and then set that to styled.h3 with the backtext. We'll set the font size to 24 pixels, the font weight to 600, and the margins, go ahead and set that to 160 pixels top. Left and right will be set to 0, and the bottom is set to 48 pixels. To render this out within our container, what we could do in here, since we have row nested, we can just add a div with a class name of row. Close that. We can just render out subhead. And the text of subhead for the first one is going to be buttons. Let's go ahead and copy and paste this. And the second one's going to be search bar. Save that, and if we preview it, it's aligned perfectly, but we still have that background pink, so go ahead and erase that. Perfect, so we've already created two components, the container and the subhead, which is great. But the very next thing that we're going to jump in is actually creating our button. This is where it can get a little confusing, so please pay attention. What we're going to do is pretty much the same thing that we did earlier. So const buttons is going to be styled.atag. Add those backticks in and set the height to 48 pixels, the line height to 48 pixels. The padding is going to be set to 0 top and bottom and 64 pixels left and right, and the font weight is going to be 600. Now the color is going to be black, but I want to show you how to reference this black color rather than using the #000 hex code. So I did mention earlier we have a global.js which contains all of our colors. Now we could import that in our project or our project file, which is app.js. So import colors, and we're going to import it from styles/global.js. Now, since we are using backticks, we can use something called template literals, which allows us to write JavaScript within this backticks or this string. So using a $sign and brackets, we can access colors, and for our, I want to see if it lets us show the properties. Okay, so it doesn't let us show it yet. But the properties of colors were white, black, primary, secondary, and gray. So we need black. And I think if we hover on it now, or over on black, it's not letting us see it, so that's a little weird. But inside colors here, we got global.js, which is colors. We have these properties we can use. So since we're using black, we could just do it like so. We can also use background color and use the same method with the backticks and set the background color to white. Now I did make a mistake up here with imported colors. We need to make sure we add brackets in here and save that. Now I think when we hover on this, it should allow us to see the properties that we can access. So they're all strings and we can access these colors. Next up, we need to set the cursor to pointer. That way when we hover on it, we get a pointer. And the margin, we want to set it to a 0 top and 24 pixels. That is because between each button we're going to render, we want to add space between each other so that we can just add some breathing room. Next up is our font size, and the font size in this case, we're just going to set it to 14 pixels. And also set text decoration to none. Let's go ahead and save this and see how it turned out. Before we preview it, we need to render buttons out. So in the, or underneath the subhead buttons, let's go ahead and add a div with a class name of row. And inside our row, we can render out buttons. For our first button, we are going to call it playlist. Let's save that and see how it turns out. Perfect. We're just missing one thing, which is our border radius. So border dash radius, and we're going to set that to 100 pixels. So we've got the button coded out just the way we want it. And what we can do next is just render this out 3 more times so that we have 4 buttons. So with style components, we want to be able to pass in a prop such as outline, primary, and secondary, just so that we can differentiate the types of buttons we can have. To do that, what we can do is just add a $ in brackets, and then with the props function, write props.outline. And with styled components, what we're going to do is write end and CSS with the backticks. This allows us to write CSS within the prop.outline, or this little function here. So it's currently underlined because it's not defined. To define it, what we could do is add a comma with the brackets and type in CSS so that we can import CSS from styled components. Scroll back down to where we wrote our outline, and we're going to set the background color, or just the background, to transparent, and the border to 1 pixel solid, and also use the colors.black. Save that, and since we've already passed the outline prop to the second button, if we preview it, we can see that it's different because we're passing that outline prop. We can copy this 2 more times, and for the third button, it's going to be a primary. And in the primary, the only thing that's changing is the background color. So the background color is going to be colors.primary. And for our fourth one, get rid of outline and add secondary. We can do the same that we did to the primary and just change the background color, calling the template literals colors.secondary. Save that, and for our third button, go ahead and pass a primary prop. And for our fourth button, pass in the secondary prop. Save that, and what should happen is we should have a default white border radius to 100% button. The second one will be an outline button. The third one will have that primary color, which was the orange, and then the fourth one will have a secondary color, which was the green. If we preview this, we get an exact match of what we're going for in our mock. This is great, and you can kind of already see the power of styled components. Now back in our project, we can kind of see a little bit of an issue, and this is where our elements.js comes in hand. So the issue that I'm seeing is the fact that we need to define our components before we can render them out. So if we have several components being defined up here, we can see that it can get kind of lengthy and you won't get to the function or the app for a while, especially if you have a lot rendered out. So what we could do in this case is let's go ahead and copy the buttons and get rid of it from our app.js. And inside our elements.js, we can just paste it in here. We need to export it, so don't forget to put export const buttons. And we have 2 more things that we need to do. We can see that style is not defined and colors is not defined. So let's go ahead and define styled. So it's going to be import styled, and we need to also do the CSS. We're going to import this from styled components. And we also need to bring in the colors. So import colors, don't forget the brackets. And we're going to import it from global.js. So save that, and everything should look great over here. Now, if we save the app.js, we're going to get errors, and it's going to say buttons is not defined. To make buttons defined, we need to import it. So import buttons, and we're going to import this from our elements.js. So it's going to be exit out of this file and then into styles and elements.js. This will use the tree shaking method and bring in buttons from elements.js. If we save app.js, we can see everything is rendered out perfectly, and it gets rid of this extra fluff in our app.js. We can also see that we don't necessarily need to use colors anymore in our app.js, so we can get rid of this. And we can also get rid of the CSS. Actually, we don't want to get rid of it just yet because we still need to do our search bar. So next things up is our search bar. We can see that the search bar looks like this. It's got border radius. It's the same height as our buttons, and it's also got this SVG search icon. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here because inputs don't allow pseudo elements. We can't necessarily make our input a styled component. We would need to make a parent div the styled component, and nested within the search bar component is going to be our input because we need to render out this SVG. I'll show you that in a second, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and create a const search bar, and this is going to be styled.div with the backticks. Now, if we weren't using an SVG to render that icon, we could certainly do styled.input. But in this case, we want to add that SVG. So we're going to have to do a styled.div and nest the input inside this div. So our search bar is going to have a height of 48 pixels with a width of 700 pixels. The position is going to be set to relative, and the margins are going to be 0 and 24 pixels. Inside the search bar is where we're going to nest our input styles. So the height is 48 pixels. Width is also 700 pixels, and the padding is 0 pixels top and bottom and 64 pixels left and right. Our border radius is 100 pixels, and the border is set to none. We don't want that ugly thing. And the font size is set to 14 pixels, similar to our buttons. A lot of times when you're customizing inputs and buttons, you want them to look similar and have the same heights. That way, if they're ever going to be side by side, actually we don't need a position relative. That way, if they're going to be side by side, you don't want them to look wonky or just different sizes. It looks a little weird. The outline is going to be none. And finally, the color is going to be the colors.black. So colors.black. And we have an issue here. Let's change that to this. And actually I lied, we need to do one more thing. The placeholder, we can't forget the placeholder. The placeholder is going to have that gray color. So placeholder. And this uses nested elements similar to Sass, so that's pretty cool. The placeholder is going to be color and then colors.gray. I'll go ahead and save that. And for the search bar, we need it to render underneath the search bar subhead. So don't forget to add the div class name row. And if you're watching this, I would recommend you to, what's going on here? Create a styled component of row, and instead of using class name, just go ahead and render out row like so, like this. That way you can just keep up with the whole style component structure. But I just wanted to show you how you can use class names with styled components because it's not that big of a deal to do so. So go ahead and render out search bar. Now, we can't just leave it search bar as an input because we are using it as a div. If, like I mentioned before, if it was input, style.input, we can just leave it as a search bar closing bracket. I can't even speak, bracket. Search bar closing bracket, and that would work. But in this case, since it's nested, because we need to render that SVG, we are going to have to pass an input in here. And we can make this self-closing instead of having another tag. Now, the placeholder is going to be search for podcast, news, stories, etc. And so we can just pass that in as an attribute, placeholder. And we also need to set a type of text. So if we save this, we should be well on our way. Everything looks great. We're just messing that icon. And the icon is coming from SVG folder, search.svg. We can import that like so. So just go ahead and write import. We're going to call it search icon. So we're going to import search icon from svg search.svg. And we're going to just render out an image. So image is going to use source, search icon. It's going to be self-closing. And it's going to have this line under it because we need to pass in an alt tag. So the alt tag can just be called search icon. Save that, and let's see. Oh, that's the wrong one. Let's look at how it looks. We are having an issue because it's not aligned properly, and we can easily fix that. So within the search bar, outside of the input, right here, we can just do image, set the position to absolute. We want to make the top 50% from the top. And this is the reason why we did a relative position on the parent, because the image or the SVG is going to be positioned absolute. And the left is 24 pixels. And then we're going to transform and translate the Y to negative 50%. That way it could be centered vertically. So negative 50%. Finally, the Z index needs to be more than 1. That way, we'll just set it to 10. That way we can make the SVG on top of the search input, and the width to 16 pixels with a height of 16 pixels as well. Save that. If we preview it, we can see it's centered perfectly. Everything looks great. It's all lined up perfectly. I want to search for a podcast named Reply All, which is my favorite podcast. And yeah, I mean, everything looks good. One thing I do want to mention is, actually first, before I mention that, let's take the search bar input and cut it out of our app.js, go into our elements, paste it in here. We can do export, save it. And then with buttons, we can also use tree shaking method to pull in the search bar. So let's go ahead and pull that in. And since we aren't using colors, we can get rid of it. And we can also get rid of the CSS since we're not using that in here. We're using it in the elements.js. So save that. And if we jump back into our project and refresh, no errors and everything looks tremendous. So what I wanted to go over before ending this video is in elements.js, we can see that we're using props like so, but there's also another way to use props with a ternary operator. Now only use the ternary operator when you have two different elements. In this case, we had 3 or 4. That's why we couldn't use it. But in our border radius, I want to make an input that doesn't have a border radius and one that does. So what we could do is use props function and then props. We're going to call it squared. So if it has a squared prop, it's going to not have a border radius. And if it doesn't have a squared prop, it's going to have a border radius. So if squared is true, go ahead and let it be 0 pixels. Else we're going to be 100 pixels. Save that. And in our search bar over here, if we pass in a squared prop, it's going to not work. So I don't know how to spell squared, right? Is that the issue? Yes. Squared. So it gets rid of the border radius and it makes our search bar boxy or squared. So that is using a ternary operator when you have 2 different elements you want to differentiate between. And if you have more than 2, you can always use the prop and CSS method. Other than that, honestly, that's really the basics that you really need to know. So I kind of showed you how to use styled components effectively, use it with props, and also make sure that you're using it in a proper manner to where it's not really all that busy, and you can kind of use that tree shaking method to bring in elements that you are using and avoid elements or not necessarily call them if you're not using them at all. So what I would add to this is I would take the container and subhead and maybe put it in global. That way in a bunch of different pages and a bunch of different components, I would need to use container and maybe the subhead. Other than that, I don't really have anything else to add. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, and please leave some feedback down below. I always want to get better and hope to see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.